very much. So who is already familiar with propensity scores? Okay, so good. A bit like the last talk, my assumption is that you don't know anything about propensity scores. So if you don't, it's good. If you do, you maybe learn something, but maybe learn less than the other people. Okay, so we are going to talk about the theory behind propensity scores and appreciate how they can be used to adjust for confounding. So we'll talk about why we would use them, how we would use them in practice, and how they compare with multivariable methods of confounding adjustment. So again, to recap, confounding by indication. It's all about differences between people and how those differences are associated with the reason why we give some people one treatment and other people either no treatment or different treatments. Okay, so here again we have a general practitioner and we have two patients. I don't know if you can see these patients very well. Can you see them very well? Can you see that they're different to each other? Good. Okay, so at the top here, I'll be generous. We've got somebody who's a little bit overweight and he enjoys a lot of junk food. He probably smokes a lot and he drinks a lot, and I don't think he does much exercise. She looks quite different to me. I don't think she has a lot of junk food and she looks like she's quite active. Okay, so let's say they've got the same GP, this lady here. They're the same age, they've got the same GP, but if they go see their GP on the same day, I hope that the GP is going to give him a statin. I think she's only gone to the GP because she's going on a yoga retreat and she needs a vaccine for whichever country she's going to. She doesn't need a statin. So they're quite different people. Now, normally when we do a study, if we want to compare people given one treatment with people given no treatment or a different treatment, we'll usually use a multivariable method to adjust for confounding. The problem is, within our big populations in an electronic health record database, it's very hard to tell if our exposed population tends to look a bit more like him and our unexposed population tend to look a bit like her. On an individual level, we would all know not to compare him with her and assign differences in outcomes to his statin. Yeah? If we wanted to look at the effect of statins, we just would not compare him with her. But what if our statin group are just a bit more like him and our no statin group are a bit more like her? I think it would be difficult to know just by looking at the data that this is the position we're in. So I think confounding by indication is probably the biggest of all the problems we have in pharmacoepidemiology. Okay. I think that propensity scores are potentially one solution to this problem. So if we're going to make comparisons between people, they need to be fair comparisons. Patients who are given drugs are different to people who are not given drugs. We need to try and account for those ways as best we can and then do our analysis. So options for overcoming confounding of any kind are randomization, as we know, multivariable regression. We could use a case-only approach, as we talked about earlier, or we could potentially use propensity scores. There are other methods too, but these are four of the most common. Okay. So you know that in multivariable regression, we construct a single statistical model and we model the relationship between the exposure and the outcome independently of all of the other confounding variables. But they're all included in the model, and everybody in the study population gets included in the analysis. Okay? Sounds fairly straightforward. And you all know that the output that you may get would look something like this. Is this familiar to people? You've all done this kind of thing before where you've got, so the first line here, we've got the hazard ratio for some exposure, I've called it exposed, with some outcome, and the hazard ratio is 0.87 and the confidence intervals are all below 1. But at the same time in my output, I get other hazard ratios associated with the other variables in the model. So here I've got things like diabetes, heart failure, and it tells me what's the independent association of those variables with the same outcome. Yeah, also familiar. Now, multivariable regression is great, but I think it also has some problems. I think it's potentially a sort of a black box approach. What I mean by this is that if our groups are fundamentally different from each other, so if our exposed group looks mostly like the obese guy who's eating burgers, and our unexposed group looks mostly like the woman who's doing yoga, we'll still run the regression and we'll get an answer, but we won't realise that there was this problem in the data. Which brings us on to propensity scores and how I think they can help us to avoid this problem. So we'll talk about the theory, approaches to using them, and we'll use a practical example to take us through how this works. So the theory is that the propensity score itself is simply the probability that an individual would receive a drug based on the observed distribution of risk factors for receiving the drug. And I'll talk you through an example so you can see intuitively how this works. But we start by thinking about what are the factors that might influence the decision to prescribe a drug for a patient. And we use that to calculate a probability for each person. Now, ultimately, the research question that we will be interested in is going to be something to do with an exposure. Let's say it's a statin, because in the example it is, and the unexposed people are going to be people not taking a statin. And ultimately, we may be interested in some outcome after taking a statin. So that's what we're really, really interested in. But to use a propensity score, we start off by ignoring this bit. And instead, we look back in the patient's medical history. And we look for the association between having the exposure and various things in your medical history. So effectively, we treat the exposure itself, so receiving the statin, as an outcome. And we look at what are the risk factors for receiving that exposure. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit like a case control study. So this is the starting point for using propensity scores, that we start just with the exposure and look at the risk factors. So we think of all the risk factors we can, and we put them into a statistical model as exposures that may have led to the outcome, which is receiving a statin. We simply run a logistic regression model with all of those variables in it, and after running that regression model, we then run a simple command in the software that calculates a probability for each patient in the group that says, based on their risk factors, what was the probability that they would be prescribed a statin. It doesn't actually matter at that point whether the patient did receive a statin. The probability will be a true probability if we've got a good model. So in other words, every patient within the data set who has a propensity score or a probability of 0.2 will have had a 20% chance of being prescribed a statin. Some of them will have genuinely got a statin, and some of them won't. That's just how the way it works. So if you had a 20% chance, that would mean it was quite a low chance. Maybe you just have a 20% chance because you're aged 65 and you're a male, but you don't have any other major risk factors for receiving a statin. Now, if you think intuitively, if you were to take 65-year-old males with no other risk factors, some of them would be on a statin, not that many. Most of them would not be on a statin. So intuitively, that makes sense, I think, yeah. So you've got this position where some of the people with a score will be taking the drug, some of the people with the same score will not be taking the drug. And we're going to make use of that within our analysis. So the research question that we were interested in a few years ago was whether or not people taking a statin were protected against mortality after having pneumonia. Okay, so we weren't interested in whether starting a statin when you've got pneumonia was protective, purely whether if you were on a statin when you got pneumonia, whether that was protective. And we did this within a database in the UK called the Health Improvement Network. It's very similar to the CPRD. It's based on many of the same GP practices. And the eligible patients were in the database between 1995 and 2006 and aged over 40 years. The design we used was a cohort, and we started off by selecting all of the statin users who were eligible within the database. We matched each of them to a non-user, so somebody not taking a statin, on age, sex, being at the same general practice, and being present in the database at the same time that the other person got their statin. We then calculated a propensity score for receiving a statin based on a whole range of variables, which I'll show you in a minute, a range of variables which we thought may influence a doctor's decision to prescribe a statin. And this was using conditional logistic regression with statin status as the outcome, so yes or no, and the covariates as the exposures. So we started off by thinking, what might influence a decision to prescribe a statin? So high lipids, so statins lower lipids and then hopefully reduce the risk of a heart attack. So you would hope that high lipids should be quite influential in a decision to prescribe a statin. Yeah? So here's the data, and I've broken it down by, in the columns you've got statin users and non-users, and then in the rows you can see people who've got hyperlipidemia and people who've got no hyperlipidemia. Now, not surprisingly, amongst people who've got hyperlipidemia, 30%, amongst statin users, 30% have high lipids. Yeah? Amongst non-users, only 3% have high lipids. So that's intuitively makes sense, yeah? That's how we would expect the data to look. If we imagined that having high lipids was the only factor in the world that influenced whether or not you got a statin, then we could then very simply calculate the probability of being prescribed a statin if you have high lipids. Yeah? If you imagine nothing else influences that decision, just having high lipids. So it would be this very simple probability equation here. What's the probability of receiving a statin given that you have high lipids? And so it's literally, in our study population, if we take everybody with high lipids, it's the number of people with high lipids who are receiving a statin divided by the total number of people with high lipids. And it would be 0.7. This would then be the propensity score for everybody with high lipids. So that includes the people who are not prescribed a statin, okay? This is really, really important point to get, that everybody with high lipids would have a propensity score of 0.7. Some of them will have got a statin, some of them won't have got a statin, okay? But that would be the score for everybody with high lipids. We would then calculate at the same time, what's the probability of being prescribed a statin if you don't have high lipids? Because this is everybody else in the data set, yeah? And it turns out that we would do the same thing. We would calculate what's the probability of receiving a statin given that you've got normal lipids, and it would be the number of people, so the total number of people who have got normal lipids would be the denominator, and the numerator would then be the total number of people with a statin and normal lipids. This would give us a number of 0.13. So it would mean that everybody in the whole data set, regardless of whether they're taking a statin or not, would have had a probability of taking a statin of 0.13. Yeah, everybody with me? Great. So that would be in the strange world where only having high lipids influences the chance of taking a statin. Of course, that's not the case, and there are other things that would influence the risk of being prescribed a statin. So the second one, you may imagine, would influence the chance of having a statin is a history of coronary heart disease. So again, we would hope that people who've got this history might be prescribed a statin. So here we've got, I've broken the data down into 4 strata. So starting off with people who've got both high lipids and coronary heart disease, and then people who've just got high lipids but no coronary heart disease and normal lipids, and then neither high lipids nor coronary heart disease. So kind of graded from the sicker people down to the more healthy people down here. Okay? So these are what the data look like, and the propensity score is then simply a read across of, from these strata, what's the proportion of people who are treated with a statin. So 83% of people in this group are treated with a statin. It means that the propensity score for everybody in the data set who's got high lipids and coronary heart disease is 0.83. Yeah? Conversely, amongst people who've got neither high lipids nor coronary heart disease, the propensity score will be 0.09. There may still be some people in this group who do get a statin, but their propensity score is still 0.09. Okay? So of course, we think that there are probably lots of factors that influence that prescribing decision. And in fact, in our final model, we had about 30 different variables that we thought could influence this decision. So we've got things like whether or not people smoke, whether they've got diabetes, atrial fibrillation, whether they're using a whole range of other medications. There's just a whole load of different things that we thought could influence that decision. Yeah.
Do you mind going back to the slide? I noticed you have socioeconomic status. That's very qualitative. How do you kind of quantify it? Just wondering.
Good question. So, depending on your setting, so in the UK, we have access to individual patient postcode level. So, a postcode would typically include, let's say, 30 houses. So, it's a small local area. And we've got broken down into 5 strata of things like income level. And so it's like a scale of relative poverty. And so we would have it on a 5 stratum level. Which of those strata are you in your postcode? Yeah. Any other questions up to this point? No. Okay, so we've calculated our propensity score having run this logistic regression model with those 30 variables and then calculated for each individual patient what was their propensity score. We then assume that within a level of the propensity score, whether a patient received the drug or not was purely at random. So for everybody with a score of 0.8, we assume that everything else about them is equal. Yeah? Some of them got the treatment, some of them did not get the treatment. But if I could just compare everybody with a score of 0.8, I should get an answer that's free from confounding, because those 2 groups of people, treated and untreated, with a score of 0.8 should be very similar to each other. Yeah? It relies on the fact that doctors' prescribing habits are a bit messy and a bit haphazard. It doesn't mean that they're totally awful. It doesn't mean that when I go see my doctor, he just spins a wheel and gives me whatever drug the wheel lands on. But it means that there's a little bit of variation in how prescribing happens. And those, I think, who here is a prescribing doctor? So would you agree that there is maybe a little bit of variation in how prescribing happens? A little bit, okay. This is no criticism of how clinical medicine works. It's purely I think it's just a fact that there are some patients who maybe don't want to take treatments, other patients more so. There's variation, okay. Yeah, please don't hear that as criticism. It means that for us as investigators, we can make use of this variation. And what we could do is potentially one of three major things that we can do. We could either match patients who've got very similar scores to each other. So for every statin user, I could match them all with a non-statin user with a very similar score. What happens if I can do that? It means that my baseline table of the exposed and the unexposed will look very, very similar. So the age, the sex, the distribution of heart disease, diabetes is going to look very, very similar between the exposed and the unexposed. It means I could then run a very simple Cox model or Poisson regression where I don't need to adjust for anything because I've got these two populations where their distribution of risk factors is the same. Known risk factors is very important to say. So that's one thing I could do. I could stratify, so I could look separately at people with a score of 0.8, 0.6, whatever, and just do my comparisons within strata and then combine them. Or I could just adjust for the score itself in a statistical model. It turns out that if I adjust for the score, rather than those 30 individual variables that contribute to the score, it actually does a very similar job in terms of the adjusting for confounding. What's really important to remember is if I match and my baseline table 1 shows them being very similar to each other, we have to remember that it's not the same as randomization and that patients could still be very different from each other on factors that we didn't include in the propensity score and that we don't know about. Okay? So a bit more about the theory. When we have calculated the score for our exposed and unexposed, we can then look at the distribution of the scores in those two groups. And this is really informative. So here we've got, I've taken this from a really nice paper written by Till Sturmer in 2006, which is a great kind of simple approach to propensity scores. If you want to get a paper to look at I would recommend this one. And here on the Y, on this axis we've got the number of subjects, and on the x-axis we've got the propensity score, so ranging from 0. So a score of 0 would mean very, very unlikely to be prescribed the drug, up to 1, which means extremely likely to be given the drug. Yeah. So here the broken line shows you the distribution of scores for an unexposed group. So it's tending to be towards the 0. And for here we've got the distribution for the exposed patients, and it tends to be closer to 1. But what you can see is that there are no exposed subjects in this group here. So at the lower end of the score, everybody is untreated. Yeah? This, if you like, is a way of finding our yoga retreat women. So the first cartoon I showed you with a woman who was going on a yoga retreat, I think the people who are a bit like her are all in this group here, this low distribution of the propensity score. Conversely, I think over here we've got this high score and everybody's exposed. There are no unexposed people with a score at this extreme end. This is all of our overweight, junk food eating guys who sit around all day and they're all taking statins. as a cartoon example. So when I said at the start of the session, it's very difficult to identify these unusual groups of patients. Well, this is one way that you can potentially find them, is by doing this propensity score and then comparing the distribution of exposures. Okay? The argument then is that if we want to do a fair comparison between exposed and unexposed, then maybe we ought to only look at people who have a propensity score that's within this distribution where both exposed and unexposed people exist. Yeah? So maybe we ought not to include these people and these people in our analysis. Okay? Now in reality, the distribution rarely looks quite as nice as this. It may look a bit more like, even this is quite nice, it may look a bit more like this, where you've got a full range of scores in both the exposed and the unexposed, but you've got a definite tail off amongst the exposed at the lower end and amongst the unexposed at the higher end. Okay, this is probably more like the reality. There's another argument that says, if we want to make a fair comparison, maybe we ought not to include the people at the very extremes of the score and who were treated contrary or other than you would have expected from their score. So here you've got people with very, very low scores but who are given the treatment. Conversely, you've got people with very, very high scores who are not given the treatment. And the question is, are these really weird people? And if they're really weird, how are they weird? And do we want to include them in the analysis? So there's a question that we may want to exclude them. There may be something that we don't know about those people, but which is really important for our research question and that we can't account for in the analysis. Okay, so back to the research question that we were interested in, and it was comparing statin users against non-users. So we started off with 130,000 users and 600,000 non-users. So we calculated a propensity score amongst that patient population using logistic regression and this list of 30 variables. We then looked forward to see who got a record of pneumonia. And it turned out 1,400 of the statin users and about 7,500 of the non-users did. So here's the distribution of propensity scores amongst that population. So it isn't nice like in the Till-Sturmer cartoon example. What we've got is, amongst the non-users, a big group with a very low score. That intuitively makes sense. And it may not be so visible to you, but we do have a few people with very high scores, but very, very few of them. Okay. Amongst the users, we were a bit surprised to see that not so much this peak towards 1, we'd expect that. These are people who you'd think should be taking statins. But there are quite a lot of people who are at the lower end of the score. Any thoughts on why we might have people, quite a lot of people at the low end of the score? I can think of two quite different reasons why we might have people at this end. Well, one is, remember we're using electronic health records to do this, and they're not perfect. They exist for a clinician to keep a track of their patients, not for me to do research. So it's possible that I'm missing some important information on the patients. So it could be these people have got really great reasons for being on statins, but it's just not in the record that I've got access to. So it could be some missing data. And this is a big problem for me if that's the case. I can't verify if it's the case, but it could be. It's also possible that there are lots of people who are taking statins who we might call the worried well. So these are people who are not ill, they don't have big risk factors for heart disease, but they feel that They just want to prevent any future harmful outcomes. And so they've asked their doctor for a statin because they're worried that they may get a heart attack. Okay. I don't know whether we're in that situation or the situation of missing data. It's impossible for me to tell. There could be other options too that I've not thought of.
So just another random question. So it will be possible if I don't have any risk factors, I'm just worried about it, and my doctor will still prescribe regardless?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah. So it could be, so remember that these are not people with zero chance of being prescribed a statin, just low. So it could be that you're in an age group where maybe you're my age and you're worried about heart disease. Maybe somebody distant relative of mine has had a heart attack, and so I've just thought, well, I want to prevent that if I can, so I'm going to take a statin. And so in the UK, potentially you would have a discussion with the GP, and if you insisted, maybe they would put you on a statin. Yeah. So remember I said that there are different ways of using the propensity score, and one is to match individuals with similar scores. Well, the problem is, because we've got very few people with high scores amongst the non-user population, if I match people, I'm going to run out of potential matches for all these people here with high scores. So I maybe will lose some important information by doing this. So we decided not to match, and instead we decided that we would adjust for the score in the analysis instead. Okay? So that means we have a statistical model where we just have the exposure, statin or not, and the propensity score. And this could be as a categorical variable or a continuous variable, depending on what made most statistical sense. But who did we include in the analysis? So here's a really busy table, and it shows you the breakdown of the data into 20 groups of the propensity score. So 1 is the people with the lowest score, 20 is the people with the highest scores. So this is our sickest group and our healthiest group according to the data we've got. And here you've got the unexposed group, and here you've got the number in each category and the number of people who died in each category. And then the same for the exposed group. Okay. Now, what you'd notice is that we've got, first of all, we might want to think about the extreme ends of the score. Remember I said that I'm worried that people at the very extreme ends who are treated contrary to their score are weird. There's something odd about them. So we decided up front, this is before seeing the data by the way, we decided up front that we would definitely not include the people in these number 1 and number 20 groups. So we left them out of the analysis. Interestingly, what we also see here is that in the unexposed group, if you look down this column of deaths, you've got all the way down in the mid-teens, mid to high teens, the percentage of people who die in each of these groups. So it's about 15 in this, 14, 17. Amongst the sickest group, number 20, in the untreated population, we only had 8% of them die. So that, in a way, the people who seem to be the least likely to die are our sickest group who are not taking statins. Now, this would make me worry that I'm somehow missing important information on that group, potentially including whether they died or not. Because I can't think of any good biological reason why my lowest risk of death would be in this group. Seems odd. So anyway, we decided to leave that group out. We then, having looked at the data, decided to leave out this group here. The reason being that there are very, very few exposed people and there are almost no outcomes amongst the exposed. So this is, if you like, is our group where almost everybody is untreated. So this doesn't seem to be a very useful comparison. it meant that our primary analysis population was then just the group in the propensity score groups from 9 to 19. So if you imagine you were doing a regular cohort study and a multivariable analysis, this is quite different to what you would have as your primary analysis population in the final analysis. So here are the results. So what we found was that for the category, so groups 9 to 19, our hazard ratio for death following pneumonia was 0.67 and confidence intervals were 0.49 to 0.91. Now, you might just think, well, you've just run an analysis on quite a small group or a relatively small group of your whole study population. Maybe you just got the answer you wanted by doing this cherry picking which group to analyse. So we've also looked at what would happen if we included a different population in the analysis. And so first of all, let's look at what would happen if we included everybody from groups 2 through to 19. Well, in fact, it makes almost no difference. So it turns out our hazard ratio will be 0.66. So it's very similar. And what about if we included absolutely everybody? So this would be more similar to what would happen if we did a traditional multivariable analysis. And the hazard ratio does change a little bit there. It goes to 0.72. So it's a weaker effect if we include absolutely everybody in the analysis. And then finally, if we do an analysis that only leaves out this 20th group here. So remember, this is the group where I'm worried that this stratum here of unexposed people with high scores have got an artificially low rate of death. So if we leave that group out, then our hazard ratio goes back to 0.6. So in fact, this difference between 0.72 and 0.66, qualitatively it may not be that big anyway, but in fact I think numerically it's entirely driven by this strange group of unexposed who have a very low risk of death compared to everybody else. So our conclusion was that there seemed to be potentially some protective effect of taking a statin if you get pneumonia. Now obviously you would expect that people who are taking statins have a protective effect against death anyway, because we know from trials that the statins protect you from death. This effect of 0.66 or 0.67 is a bit stronger than you would expect from trials. So we imagined that this was potentially some additional protective effect if you have pneumonia. So people have claimed there may be anti-inflammatory effects of statins that may have additional benefits. Aside from this, we did a much bigger study where we looked at about 30 different outcomes for statins, and we found no difference between exposed and unexposed for a whole range of outcomes that people have suggested may be either caused or prevented by statins. This was the only one where we saw an effect. Okay, so then moving on to think about how propensity scores compare with multivariable analysis. Are there any questions before we talk about this? Sorry, just behind you.
Sorry. So this propensity score calculation is kind of like a dimensionally reduction.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
If this dimensional reduction happens, there must be some information we lost. So why just we match the population with the same sex, same age, or same education level, such background variables directly, and then compile their results.
Oh, so why not just individually match?
Yes.
Ah, well,
rather than calculate the...
Yeah, good question. If you individually match, you will run out of potential matches, so you won't find people who are identical. When you propensity score match, so if I take one person with a score of 0.8 and match them with another person of 0.8, the two people won't have the score of 0.8 for exactly the same reasons. So it may be that they are both men in their 60s, but one smokes and the other has diabetes, which seems to get them a score that's quite similar. So I matched them on the score. But if I wanted to individually match, I couldn't match those two people. It then works out that because I'm doing this on a large population, that although the individuals are not matched on exactly the same covariates, the distribution of covariates through the population then becomes very similar if I've done a good job with the propensity score model. So that's one reason why you would do this rather than individually matching, because you wouldn't find enough people to match on.
So if using different models to calculate the scores, the result will be large influenced?
Yeah, potentially. So yeah, it depends very heavily on what you put in your propensity score model. That's a really important factor. Yeah. So they're not magic. You'll hear some people talk about them as though we must only ever use them because they're so much better than multivariable. I don't believe that. I think that they have some advantages and some disadvantages, and that we need to be aware that they are only as good as the data that we've got access to and that we can measure. So there will still be things within the data, or not within the data, there will still be factors that are different between patients potentially, but that we couldn't account for, and they won't help with that.
And I have a concern that even the people who have similar propensity scores, is there that covariant or variable background information is the similar, exact similar, or not? Even the scores is same, maybe their background information is not similar.
So do you mean you're worried because my people with score 0.8, one of them's a smoker and one's got diabetes? Or
yeah, my worry is if even the probability of is the same, if that the score is the same, but the sex or education or some other variables, the value of the variable is not the same.
right, okay, so on an individual level between patients, because it's a big population and those factors will even out, that doesn't matter. What would matter is if I've measured the variables better on some people than on other people. That would then still be a big problem. It would also be a problem if I was doing a multivariable model. So they suffer from some of the same problems as each other.
So it's kind of limitation?
Yeah.
It's not a perfect method?
Absolutely not a perfect method. Sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't, for various reasons, and I've found sometimes journal editors or reviewers will send a comment back to say, we don't believe your results because you didn't use propensity scores, which to me implies that they don't really know, or they don't really understand what we were doing, because there is nothing magic about this method.
So we use different methods to calculate and to compare the results?
Yeah, you can do. In fact, so in this example here, I haven't shown it on a slide, but we also did it as a multivariable regression. We got the same answer. The only reason you might get a different answer is if you're, so if I go back, so you could see here that, in fact, it didn't really matter which categories we included in the analysis. The answer was quite similar. If the answer had been quite different in our primary analysis, then a multivariable approach would have given us a different answer. And to me, that would be the only advantage of this method, is that it helps us to properly select the group of people that we really should be comparing. But other than that, the data are the same. So the information we're putting in from the variables, whether it goes into the propensity score or into a multivariable model, it's all the same data. So it really doesn't make much difference. Does that help? Okay.
So my question is, is the two groups truly
compound. So the distribution of propensity score within two groups seems quite different. So as you said, the unmeasured confounding factor may influence the two propensity score can be different from the major propensity score.
Yeah.
And although the propensity score analysis very strong method, these two groups don't seem so comparable and quite different activities. And so no statistical method can completely adjust the difference between two groups. So are there any good method to
so you're absolutely right. It's possible that, so I mean, using the propensity score means that we were able to adjust for the differences between groups that we could measure, but in the same way as it would happen in a multivariable model, if the data that we've got are imperfect, and they are imperfect, or if there are other variables that we should have included but we didn't have access to, then there could be residual confounding. There could absolutely still be all of those problems that we haven't got around. We have to make the assumption in our final model that all other confounding has been dealt with, and we know this isn't true. Okay. We know this isn't true, but we have to make the assumption and then say a limitation is that we could still have other confounding, but yeah, we can't get around that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
My question is very simple about variable selection. Can we use same variable to calculate propensity score and logistic regression adjust to adjust for confounding?
Yeah. Yeah. You can do, in fact. So if we've done matching rather than adjustment, it turns out that when you do matching between exposed and unexposed on their propensity scores, if you do a great job, then the balance of covariates is going to be very good. Sometimes, even when you pick the best match, let's say that the distribution of ages is a bit different between the two groups, then in your Poisson model or Cox model, you could then also adjust for age. That would be completely fine. Yeah.
Can you talk something about high-dimensional propensity?
High-dimensional propensity. Has anybody come across the term high-dimensional propensity scores? These are, so I've shown you an example here where there were 30 variables in the model. You could have a model where you have about 500 variables. Okay, so you would never do this in a multivariable model because it would just break down. But the theory is, so let's take diabetes as an example. So I could split that into, so in my propensity score here, I simply have a binary variable. Does somebody have diabetes, yes or no? You could split that into, does somebody have type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes? If they've got type 1 diabetes, do they consult their GP for it rarely, occasionally, or very frequently? And if they've got type 1 diabetes, are they taking insulin, yes or no? If they're taking insulin, are they taking high dose or medium dose or low dose? If they're type 2 diabetes, are they taking insulin plus oral antidiabetics? So there are whole ways of then going into much, much more detail on what might be considered to be a single variable. And the theory behind this is that we will not only better adjust for those individual confounders, but we may also, by proxy, adjust for things that we can't measure, like frailty, for example, because maybe the frailer patients need to consult more often for all of their diseases. So even though we don't have a measure of frailty, maybe we will by proxy adjust for it. And there are then automated ways of looking at the data to work out which of these many high dimensional variables are most associated with the outcome that we're interested in, how are they associated with the exposure, and how common are they in our data set, and then ranks these variables so that we can choose the most common 500. Yeah. So this is a different way of looking at propensity scores. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there could be maybe 500 variables, for example. In multivariate analysis, you would do the multi-collinearity test before selecting the variables. I've never done a propensity score before, so would you take those into consideration before selecting the variable as well?
Yeah, so you could do that within your logistic regression model. You can look at collinearity in that model. Yeah.
But you wouldn't do the same for propensity score analysis?
In the cohort analysis that you then go on to do, no. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. We were going to talk about how they compare. So I've covered some of this. So mostly the results of a multivariable and a propensity score analysis would be very similar. It'd be very unusual for them to give you very different answers. Where I think propensity scores have a big advantage is there are two things. First of all, if you've got a very large number of confounders and you've got a rare outcome, then if you want to do a multivariable regression model, you may not be able to include all of the variables that you want to, just because of the rule of 10, say, where you would run out of the ability to adjust for all those confounders. The other reason why I think they've got an advantage is they allow us to see within our study population who is genuinely comparable, and so that I can get rid of the obese burger eating guys and the yoga women from my study population. They give me an opportunity to do this. Where multivariable analysis has a distinct advantage is that in our final analysis model, it will show me the association between each individual variable and the outcome. So I can see, is smoking in my model behaving in the way that I would expect it to? I won't be able to see that in a propensity score analysis. Really importantly, both methods still don't account for unknown confounding. And I think that people accept this easily with multivariable approaches, but there seems to be this myth with propensity scores that we've dealt with all confounding, especially if our baseline table makes people look very similar. But be very careful, it still has the same problems. Okay. So that's the end of the talk. Are there any questions before we do the workshop part?
So when we choose the overlays in to estimate the propensity score, so should we include all possible confounding factor, or we should choose the only variable related to outcomes? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so it turns out that we can potentially run into problems of statistical efficiency if we include, it's counterintuitive, if we include variables which are only associated with the exposure, that can be a problem for our confidence intervals. In theory, we want to include everything that's a traditional confounder, so something that's associated with the exposure and with the outcome we definitely want to have in the model. It turns out we can somehow improve statistical efficiency if we include variables that are only associated with the outcome as well. But mostly it's going to be variables that are associated with both. Yeah. Okay. Right, so I've got a final workshop for you. So back to small groups. This is the right one. Yeah. So you've got two scenarios. These are both made up, and they are basically potential drug safety problems, and then a little bit of information on a study that you might do to try to address that safety problem, and a series of questions for you to answer on how you think you might go about it. So again, work in small groups and see how you get on. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, or kind of like to see if there's like correlation between taking this treatment asthma and.
I think probably let's say like I think he said I think probably like stay yourself confident. I think it may make like better.
So what study design are you going for?
For number one,
Yeah.
I chose propensity score.
Ah, okay, so you so the design, so there's a cohort.
Oh, yeah, cohort.
Yeah. And you're choosing propensity scores, good idea. And what about recruitment? Who's included?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Include or exclude?
It's really difficult because I feel like everybody's at risk of developing Alzheimer's.
Ah, well, but are they? So what about if I put people?
Or, yeah, maybe like age.
Yeah.
50. Yeah, 50.
Yeah. So I don't want university students,
Yeah.
for example. Yeah. Okay. So there's an age restriction.
Yeah, age restriction. And kind of like people who are functional enough to participate in this study.
Yeah.
Like people who already have Alzheimer's might not be excluded.
Yeah. So you'd exclude.
People who have Alzheimer's already.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And also people who don't have asthma.
Yeah. So it's got to be people with asthma. Who are you having as the control population?
People who have asthma and who are not taking Solomon.
And where will you find them?
Like health records or.
Well, but in this case, you're going to collect information on these individuals at the time you recruit them. So where are you going to get your exposed from as well?
Exposure will be people who have asthma, right?
Yeah. So where will we find those patients?
Hospitals.
You could, yeah. You could find them in hospitals. Do all patients with asthma go to the hospital?
Or maybe pharmacies. Clinic.
Yeah. So maybe a respiratory clinic. Yeah.
GPs.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we don't know how to recruit. Oh yeah, this is
Yeah. Well, you do. You've just told me. Yeah. 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 And then I think the biggest problem here is follow-up. Any thoughts on how you might be able to follow people up?
talk to the same GPs.
So for 10 years,
Yeah.
what could go wrong?
They might die.
They could move, they could die. Did you think of any ways that you might be able to work around that? Well, but why? What's the research question?
Using the insurance system in Japan, in UK. So in Japan, almost all people include the same insurance system. So we can check the onset of Alzheimer.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. So
So one candidate, they use the usage of the insurance system data.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant. Okay, so so you could do this in Japan. There are other countries you could do something similar where you would recruit people. Maybe you get them from the clinic initially, and you collect all the information that you want on them that may not be included in a database, but it's important for you to know. But in fact, for the outcome, if you can link with their insurance or some other electronic health record that they're part of, it doesn't matter if they lose interest in your study, don't want to be involved, or just don't care, because in theory, you could still get the information on the outcome from the electronic health record. It's a great way of being able to keep track of people, see if they die, see if they get dementia over 10, 20, 30 years, because you can potentially do that. Yeah, I've got some solutions that I'll hand out at the end, but there is a good example of a registry for people with rheumatoid arthritis, where once they're included and we do these initial personal checks on them, then the outcome can be found through the health record over years. Yeah. Great. Okay. What about the... Did you look at the second one as well?
I look at it, but we haven't talked about it.
Okay, well maybe spend a couple of minutes on that as well then. Yeah.
It may be possible to impute such variable with
Not if you don't know it on anybody. No. If you've got some missing data and that there are lots of assumptions that you have to make to do multiple imputation, but let's say you've got information on smoking on 90% of your group and it's missing on 10%, it's possible you could impute that in some instances. Yeah.
Patients and user control. 10 times the number.
Propensity score match. Yeah. One.
Okay, I think I'm going to suggest that we stop there and we go through these examples. I realise that you probably won't have finished both of them, but it'd be good for us to talk about them and then we can just wrap up on the whole 2 days. Okay, so first of all, we've got our scenario number 1. So this is our asthma drug Salamol, and we want to know if it's associated with Alzheimer's disease. And so what study design, so you've got this idea that you're going to do a prospective study. So this happens in pharmacoepidemiology. It tends to be more expensive, but it turns out you've got enough funds to recruit 5,000 people over a 10-year period, and that you can collect lots of information on confounders on those individuals. This is something that we often can't do in electronic health records research, but can be really important. So it's an example where we've got this kind of initial idea where we're going to collect information on people ourselves. So what study design did people decide to do?
Randomized control trial.
You're doing a randomized control trial. Okay, I'm going to tell you that you haven't got that much funding. So we're not going to do a trial. But I mean, in theory, you could. It would be very expensive. what could there be? There could be a problem with doing a randomized trial as well. What might the problem be?
Maybe the scaffolder, because this drug can increase the Alzheimer's disease. Initial IRB may not approve this trial.
Yeah, so it may not be ethical to do a randomized trial, but you did. So what was it you decided to do?
We are 10 years cohort study.
So you're doing a 10-year cohort study, okay. So where were you going to find your exposed people? This is for either groups. Where are you getting your patients from?
We are getting ours from GPs.
You're getting yours.
Physicians,
Yeah.
clinics, hospitals, and insurance company.
Yeah. So I like this idea of finding them within the GPs. What would be good about finding them at the GP?
Good health record, and it's good for conducting cohort study because we are able to follow up.
Yeah. Another reason it's good is because they're from the general population, so it means that you're getting potentially a good sample from the general population. Yeah. Where were you going to find your patients?
Over 65 years and with asthma.
So over 65 and with asthma, but where will you find them? You didn't talk about where you'd find them? Yeah, okay, so it's an important thing about where, so I can see who my population is, and then I also have to find them. So your idea of the GPs is good. I liked your idea, so why are you choosing people aged over 65?
Yeah, because because our interest is the risk of developing asthma disease. So if we choose some that younger, for example, 20 years old, then it is difficult to find our interest within this 5,000 participants.
Yeah, yeah. So we need to find people who've got some chance of developing Alzheimer's over the 10-year period. So if we pick people who are 20, we've wasted our money. Okay, good. So who are you having as your unexposed population?
Like people who have asthma but who are not using Salamol.
Yeah, so you've got people with asthma, yeah, so we know that they're otherwise potentially similar to the group taking Salamol, but not taking that treatment. Any other?
Patients using other drugs.
Yeah, so you may want to make sure that they've got maybe a similar level of asthma to the people taking Salamol. Great. Okay, so what might be problems following people up for 10 years? Do you think it's easy to do that?
No, people might die, might move.
Yeah.
They may have like severe Alzheimer's and they are not able to.
Ah, that's a really good point. So maybe we're going to lose people, and maybe we're losing the people who are having the outcome. That's a big problem. Yeah. What might we do to try to avoid that problem?
One solution is competing risk model with the survival analysis or Cox model. So, for example, this where other outcomes should be treated as competing outcome.
Yeah, potentially, but I'm still worried that the people with Alzheimer's we're just going to lose altogether. And I want to know if they've got Alzheimer's. Anything? I know we talked about this in your group. One thing that you can do, and there are some good examples of this, are you can go and recruit these patients and then collect all this really important information on confounders that you need, which you may not otherwise get. But it's possible that you could then follow them up through their electronic health record. So there are examples of this, for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, where to study the new treatments for that disease, people have collected lots of detailed information on patients. But then the long-term follow-up, what they really care about is, will these patients get cancer and will they die? And that follow-up can come through the electronic health record. So it may not be important that we don't need to personally keep in touch with the patients, but they can be followed up through their record, and that can be a great way of keeping them involved. Okay. Anything else that you wanted to say about this example? Okay, well, while you can come back to it if you like, but so scenario 2, I think you maybe had less time to spend on. So this is a new antidepressant, funtoxamine, and it's been launched in the US for 5 years, but it's been linked to a possible increase of mortality from spontaneous reporting. So remember, this is a signal. You've been given access to a database of insurance claims in the States with about 5 million US citizens aged 20 to 65, and you've got some information on prescribing, comorbidities, a few bits of information on smoking, drinking, BMI, and death is well recorded, but not the precise cause. So what study design would you do?
Retrospective case control.
You're doing a case control?
Retrospective cohort study.
You're doing a prospective cohort. So why the two designs? So why would you do a case control?
Kind of compare who's taking other antidepressants, compare the mortality within the population, who's taking fundoectomy, compare the mortality rate in different groups.
So you're doing it nested amongst people who've been exposed to antidepressants?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, that would be.
Also, there's no ethical issues when it's retrospective.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's no. Yeah, I agree. There's no ethical issues, and you could do a case control study. Yeah. And why would you do a cohort?
First, we discussed the availability of self-control design. However, so neither cases or case crossover was one of the available because the exposure is not short time.
Yeah.
And the outcome is good, and the period after outcome is not available, so neither are available. So
so I agree. So the death is a problem. The exposure being potentially long is not a problem. So it's as long as we can define when the exposure is, it doesn't matter that it could be long. But the death would be a problem. Yeah.
And, the next choice was because when we use the electronic health record, we can track so many patients. So the retrospective cohort study seems attractive.
Yeah.
And also there's said that there are limited sales of this new drug, so we want to use all of the data for this drug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I think either design would work. I think that there are things that you would need to consider differently. And one thing that you would think shouldn't be a major consideration, but you're going to do this study, you're going to write it up and then publish it in a paper. Now, I might want non-epidemiologists and clinicians to read my study, and typically they will more likely understand a cohort design than they will a case control design. There's nothing less valid about the design, but it may be easier to explain to non-experts in our field what we've done through a cohort than a case control. But it's a minor consideration, but it's something to think about. Okay, great. So how are we selecting a comparator? So you've nested it within a cohort of people who've taken antidepressants, so we've kind of dealt with that, I think. But who are your controls?
Would be different, and depends on their prescription, different kind of antidepressants.
Well, but your cases are going to be dead people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your controls will be.
Oh, I guess dead people.
Non-dead people, just non-dead people.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Non-dead people.
Yeah. Okay. And
Would it be possible to compare like dead people caused by this kind of antidepressant and then dead people caused by other kind of antidepressant?
So within your group, you'd be able to look at the association with this antidepressant, other antidepressants. Yeah. Yeah. How about you guys? So who was your unexposed group?
You use other types of antidepressant
Okay.
in the same field.
Yeah. I like that. So other antidepressants. What could be the problems with that? So how might prescribing differ for the new drug and other antidepressants? This is going to be a problem for both designs, by the way. But what might be different in prescribing?
The severity of disease first.
Uh-huh. And how might that differ?
Or drug cost. For example, if the newer drug is more strong or the more expensive or so on, so the patient characteristics may be different into groups.
Yeah. So this is a really important point about new treatments. They're often given to unusual patients, and so it could be that they're given to patients who failed on other treatments or who have particular severe disease that the clinician is worried won't do well on the old drugs. So, and we may need to think about this in terms of this study question. So maybe it's given to people who are at greater risk of suicide, for example, which is then going to affect our outcome potentially. It's just something for us to be aware of. And then, so how were you going to address confounding in your designs? So you're going to use propensity scores. Great. We just learned about them. That's good. And
We said multivariate.
yeah. So you're going to do multivariable. Yeah. Okay. And then the last two things. So first of all, what's the implication of not knowing everything about lifestyle factors?
It may increase the unmeasured confounding factor.
Yeah. So it means that we may have some unmeasured confounding still, which is always going to be a problem. And then the other big one is, why does it matter if we don't know the cause of death?
Because of suicide. Suicide, for example, if the
Uh-huh.
patient is severe depression and use this new antidepressant, maybe that is what we saw is this patient is maybe higher risk of the mortality, but in fact they just for the last stage they may choose suicide.
Yeah, so maybe it's partly suicide, and that could be, and it's possible that the drug is causing, so there are these problems with antidepressants, it could be that it's causing, but we won't know. The all-cause mortality is a really it's a strange outcome. In a way, it's very homogeneous because everybody's dead, but everybody dies from something different. And if
It can be accidents.
yeah,
And
Could-
not related to this drug at all.
yeah, exactly. And I think I mentioned the other day the example of proton pump inhibitors, and they've been linked with an increased risk of all-cause mortality. Well, with any drug, if they do increase the risk of death, then they do it through some mechanism, and they will only increase the risk of death through some causes, not all causes. So it's much better to have both a hypothesis about which causes of death we think may be increased, but also to have data which tells us what the cause of death was. Often people will do studies of all-cause mortality because they had no option. All they know is whether somebody died or not. But if we look at individual causes and we see an increased risk of lots of different individual causes, it makes me suspicious that the drug is a marker of just general ill health, and that people who are ill are taking that drug. Ill people are more likely to die from all sorts of things. So if you're interested in mortality, looking very carefully at specific causes is a really, really important way to see, is this a causal effect or is it just a marker of confounding where sicker people are taking this treatment? Okay. Are there any more comments or thoughts on these two examples? I've also got some handouts with suggested solutions here. as I hand these out, be careful when you take them because you need to take two sheets. There you go. So the scenario number 1 and scenario number 2 are on separate sheets of paper. Okay. And so is there anything that you wanted to ask or comment on from the 2 days that we've been together? Yes, so you, the PowerPoints are all available, yeah? Yeah, yeah.
I can even make these available in the drive.
Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah. All of the materials
Yes, I'll upload everything. in the
available,
folder.
yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah. And it's been a real pleasure to spend the 2 days with you all. I've really enjoyed meeting you. You seem like you've got some really great ideas and great thoughts about the different things that we've been talking about. So I wish all of you very well in your research careers. And if you want to contact me for any reason, then please get my email address and you're very welcome to email me. But it's been a real pleasure meeting you all, so thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be here.